Hey folks, before we start with today's stories, remember to subscribe as it really helps the channel. My younger brother died this past February. I should have known it was coming. As kids, we were really close, my brother and I. Spent all our time looking for toads in the backyard and chasing snakes. He was the creative type, ended up a writer, kind of a hotshot too. We were still pretty close, even when the money came rolling in. These last few months, though, things got a little different. Philip just sort of faded out of my life. It's not that I didn't try to keep in contact with him. It's that he just shut down. He retreated into that big house he bought like a turtle crawling into its shell. He gradually stopped answering his phone, replying to my texts, replying to my emails. I guessed it was just growing pains. Actually, I was more than a little miffed by the whole experience. I've always been so proud of Philip, you know. I was never anything special, sort of drifting through school and out of college with a useless degree and no real ambition for anything. But Philip, he had real talent. When he put his pen to paper, stories poured out onto the page like golden honey. I always wondered how he could live with all those stories in his head. He told me once that he couldn't. That's why he had to let them out somehow. If he kept them locked up inside, they'd drive him crazy. I really should have known. I hadn't heard from Philip in 2 months when my phone lit up in the middle of the night. Through my mother's tears, I managed to gather what had happened. I jumped out of bed and drove to her side. The image of my brother swinging from his garage ceiling burned into my eyes. I was numb, thinking that was just like Philip to pick such a dramatic death. Funnily enough, it was a few days before I wondered why he would do it in the first place. Maybe that's what denial really is. Not denying the death itself, but denying its implications. After Philip died, there was the problem of his estate. He didn't have a will, didn't leave a note. What were we supposed to do with his belongings? More than that, what were we going to do with the house? I say house, but it's really more of a mansion. Philip always had a flair for the theatric. The first time I saw the house, with its stone lines and countless empty rooms, I could imagine Philip pacing through its halls wildly as the story struggled out of his pen, gasping for life. I knew it was exactly the place Philip belonged. So maybe it won't seem strange to you that I moved into his house. Just up and moved, packed all my shit, and settled down where my brother had offed himself. It seemed wrong, but it felt like home. I got a job in the town nearby and figured I'd just stay at the house until Mom and I figured what we were going to do with it. No harm in that anyway. The first few days, I ghosted up and down the wide hallways, my hands trailing lightly along the walls, wondering if Philip had touched them this way too. I wandered in and out of rooms, taking note of the things Philip had brought from our old home, the things he had bought himself, the things I had given him. I didn't touch any of that. I knew I would have to one day, but for now, neither my mother nor I had the heart to move any of it. I moved into a guest bedroom and left everything else perfectly in place. Some parts of the house Philip clearly never used, the basement for one. For such a nice house, the basement was surprisingly bare, with its expanse of decrepit walls and discolored floors. I didn't bother stalking through the endless hallways down there. If Philip hadn't been there, then there was no meaning. The attic, too, was surprisingly empty, despite being the perfect place for storage. There were a few rooms here and there that were left alone. Philip never really got settled in the home he loved so much. While I lived there, it was like living in limbo. Everything seemed ready for the day that Philip would come back. It felt like I was waiting for him too, but I still wasn't prepared for it when it happened. I came home from work one day, utterly exhausted. I hadn't really been sleeping lately. Every time I came close to sleep, visions of my brother's dangling body would pop into my head, and I'd hear the creaking sound of the rope swinging under his weight. No good. I'd rather stay awake. I got home and trudged up the stairs to the guest bathroom. I stared at the mirror for a few minutes in mute silence, memorizing every aspect of it. The gold gilt frame, the small chip on the left side, and the words, "Did you miss me?" scrawled across the front in red lipstick. My vision swam, and I stumbled out towards my bed. Was my lack of sleep giving me hallucinations? Was I dreaming right now? Could be. All I'd had lately were nightmares, if I'd been able to sleep at all. Maybe this was all one big nightmare. A few minutes of willing myself to wake up, and the ensuing frustrated tears proved that no, it was not a dream. It was very real. Too real. Even so, I dragged myself into my bed. I'd held off sleep as long as I could. I'd reached my limit. Everything felt fuzzy and strange. My brain barely made sense of the situation, which is probably why I was so calm. I passed out for 13 hours. 13 long, torturous hours. 13 hours of that swaying body, that creaking, and nothing else. When I woke up, the message was gone. All part of my fatigued brain. Either that, or some cruel trick of nature. Perhaps both. It didn't matter. It was gone now. Things were normal for a few days. My resolve weakened, and I gave into sleep, as horrible as my dreams were. They drained my spirit and left me lifeless, a body without a soul, wandering through a life that was no longer my own. A week later, I received another message. This one was a post-it note stuck to the fridge in the first floor kitchen. Milk, egg, sugar, lipstick. P. I couldn't explain this away, no matter how hard I tried. I picked the paper up and held it between my fingers, running my fingertips across the messy script. Philip's handwriting only got this messy when he was really on a roll, trying to push the story out of the pen before it fell limp at his feet. It was almost as though he'd scrolled off the note during one of his sessions. That's what he used to call it, when he got really into a story, so far into it that he couldn't see reality anymore. I walked through the house, clutching that note like it could save my life, like it could save Philip's. After I'd exhausted myself, I fell asleep with the note balled up in my fist. I woke up a few hours later to the sound of music. It was floating up from the downstairs. Queen, my brother's favorite. He'd put it on every night when he studied. It drove my mom crazy. I'd learned to live with it. I let the music guide me to the living room, where my brother's iPod was plugged into the stereo. I had walked through this house hundreds of times, memorizing every single inch of my brother's life, and I knew for a fact that this iPod had never been plugged into this machine. It should have been sitting at his bedside table. I fell to the ground and held my hands against my head as strains of "Somebody to Love" pounded into my ears. This couldn't be real, could it? And what if it was? I hadn't asked for this. Of course, I wanted my brother back, but I wanted the real him back, not all these little reminders of the man he had been. I got fired from my job the next week. I'd stopped showing up, opting to sit at home and wait for the next message to appear. Oftentimes, there'd be notes on scraps of paper strewn throughout the house. Nothing very important. Usually an address here or there, a little "have a nice day, love you," to someone who had once been special. Sometimes there was more. It all came to a head one night when I left my computer open for Philip. It was out of curiosity, really. I wanted to see if he would show up, if he would write something for me, something especially for me. If we were going to communicate, I wanted it to be direct. Some small part of my mind was still rational, but for the most part, I had abandoned myself to the fantasy of my brother coming out of his coffin. I woke up to an open Word document. Hi, David. Hi, David. Hi, David. Hey, David. Did you miss me? Did you miss me? Did you miss me? Did miss me? Did you? I like it here. I like it. Come follow me, David. I got really, really drunk that day. I mean, really fucking drunk. I didn't know what else to do, so I got wasted. What I was talking to, could it really be Philip? I didn't think so anymore. If it were Philip, he wouldn't want to scare me, and this was scaring the fucking shit out of me. A thought started to seep into my brain, fighting through my drunken haze to make itself heard. Maybe this was why Philip killed himself. There was something about this house. Something deep inside, festering, creeping, crawling. It had reached out its slimy claws and taken a hold of Philip, drew him into the garage, that rough old rope. Philip couldn't escape. My baby brother didn't commit suicide. He was practically murdered. No, scratch that. He was definitely murdered. And now, was it reaching for me? You know, to this day, I thank myself that I got so drunk. Because if I'd been in my right mind, I'd never have called the police, crying about Philip. Something got Philip, stole him away. It came for him, and now it's coming for me. I want Philip back. Please give him back, please. I was later told that I wouldn't answer any of the questions the police asked. I just kept blubbering over the phone until they decided to trace the call and send someone over to check on me. When the cops arrived, they saw the notes. All the notes I'd saved from whatever was stalking me. They listened to me crying about those nightmares, Philip's dead body, the creaking that never stopped. Even then, I could hear the creaking, always in the back of my mind. Fortunately, the cops heard the creaking too, and they followed it down to the basement, deep in the back of the basement. Did you know I was right about Philip? I was right about being stalked too. But the question wasn't what was stalking me. It was who. From early on in our childhood, I knew Philip was gay. Mom knew too, but we wanted to wait for him to tell us, for him to feel comfortable enough to broach the subject naturally. I loved him no matter what. Why would his sexuality change the way I felt? It was just him, and I loved him. But what I didn't love was his taste in men. He liked the strong, arrogant types. I watched him lust after the asshole jocks in his class. In my mind, I always thought, do better. I always wanted to warn him away from those types. I knew what cruelty they were capable of. My sweet baby brother, with his eyes constantly glued to his notebooks. No one would ever be good enough for him. I never imagined that he'd go for a psychopath, however. Based on the interrogation, the police guessed that Philip met Will when he'd first moved to the area. They'd been in a relationship for quite some time when they hit the rocks. If you talk with Will for 2 minutes, you'll see that he's paranoid. He's batshit crazy. I'm guessing that my brother didn't deal with it very well. Philip reported Will missing a few months before his death. At this point, their relationship was rocky at best, but Philip was concerned Will had hurt himself. The cop who filed the missing person report spoke to me about the incident. Philip had been frantic, crying that it had been his fault. They'd had a fight, and now Will was gone. Except that Will was never gone. My brother never went into that basement. It never occurred to him that someone could be hiding down there. Will told us gleefully how he had tortured Philip. He'd left notes around the house telling him it was all his fault. He'd left dead animals on Philip's doorstep. He'd written his own name over and over in blood so that Philip would be reminded every time he woke up about his missing lover. But it's the last part, very last part, that broke my heart, that sucked away a piece of my soul. The police found photos in Will's little camp in the basement, photos of him and Philip engaging in intimate activities, photos of Philip wearing makeup, applying lipstick, picking out dresses. Will actually giggled when he told us he'd mailed the photos to Philip, claiming to have mailed them to us, his family as well. Philip was so horrified that we knew, so horrified that he hanged himself. He actually thought we'd hate him for being gay. He never knew how much I loved him. I wondered why Will had bothered staying in that house and coming after me. He mentioned briefly about the suicide note he'd found. It was addressed to his older brother. It made me want to hurt him too. Will's eyes had turned intense and solemn as he said this. When the police asked to see the note, he said about giggling again, "Gone, gone, gone. I burned it away." No matter how many times they questioned him, he wouldn't tell them what the note said. Now I'll never know what Philip had wanted to tell me. Will didn't just murder Philip. He took my mom as well. When she heard what Will told the police, she simply broke down into nothing. She mostly just sits and stares out the window now. She isn't much to her anymore. As for me, I'll never know what is true and what isn't. Will is crazy. Who knows what parts of his stories were lies, what parts were true. But in my heart, I know the only thing I'll ever have to know. How much I hurt Philip. The pain he carried in his heart, because I never made it apparent to him that I'd always support him, always love him. I'm sorry I failed you, Philip. I'm going to make it up in the only way that I know how, because Will taught me the importance of family. And you know something? I bet he has one too. And I'll be seeing them very soon. I followed through with what I said I'd do. It didn't take long to locate Will's family. Luckily for me, he didn't like to keep his crazy to himself. He had a number of online blogs, all using his full name. He didn't seem too concerned with the safety of his family, as their names came up several times in the course of his insane ramblings. He didn't seem to hold much love for any of them, but I was broken and hateful, and I wouldn't let that stop me. At this point, it wasn't about hurting Will. It was about avenging Philip. It was about justice, so twisted and corrupt that it no longer resembled justice at all. It was only justice to me. I packed a few belongings and drove across the state. It was so easy to find their address. Will had posted it all over his damn blogs. I had a few changes of clothes, some toiletries, and cash. When I arrived a few hours later to their shitty little town, I stopped at the local hardware store to get what I needed: rope, knives, gasoline, matches. I had already brought along my gun for safe measure. I know. You buy these things in a small town, almost a guarantee that you'll get pinned for what you did, especially if it was going to make the news like I hoped it would. but I was planning on being caught. I decided to stake out their house for a few days. I needed to be familiar enough with their movements to close in effectively. I didn't bother with a hotel room. I slept in a car outside their house. They lived in an even shittier part of that shithole town, so I guessed that suspicious vehicles were common and wouldn't be reported. I guessed right. As I watched the next day, I confirmed it was Will's family. Of course, I could only go off his descriptions of them, as he hadn't posted pictures, but I could feel deep down that it was them. First, I saw a man around 50 years old, stumbling up to the house around 10 in the morning, drunk as all hell. He was heavy-set with long, greasy hair. He shouted as he crashed through the front door. His father, Marcellus. Later that day, a woman who looked slightly younger. She wasn't just heavy-set. She was a veritable mammoth, waddling about on her stumpy legs. I'm not sure where she went, with her face caked with makeup and a stained dress practically painted on her body. His mother, Candace, and finally, the one I had been waiting for. He stepped out of the house, a thin frame with unkempt hair and dark, deep-set eyes. He couldn't have been more than 8, although Will insisted in his blogs that he was 12. That's right. Will had a younger brother too, Thomas. I felt my hatred burn when I saw Thomas stepping out the door. I should have looked at him closer that day, but all I could think of was my own brother, how he should be alive, how he should be happy instead of these shitty people. I strengthened my resolve as Thomas slunk back into the house at the call of his drunken father. I was going to torture Thomas in front of his family. My hatred and anger seethed inside me all day, twisting apart my insides. When night fell, I decided to get closer to the house. I wasn't sure if I'd be able to make it inside, but I needed to get at least somewhat familiar with the home. It wouldn't be difficult, as it was one story. A few peeks in the windows, and I'd be ready to do what I came to do, perhaps as soon as the next night. I really should have looked at him closer. After Candace returned home, presumably from whoring around like the disgusting bitch she was, I crept up to the window to watch them through the night, stalked them, just like Will had done, but I really wasn't prepared for what I was about to see. I started with the living room. I crept around the left side of the house, trying to stay far enough back in the trees that the light spilling from the room wouldn't reach me. It was dark enough, didn't have to worry about passing cars spotting me. Not that they passed through here anyway. Marcellus was still drinking, stumbling around the room like a zombie. He was screaming. I couldn't tell what exactly he was yelling about, but Thomas was wincing in the middle of the room. Maybe it's because I couldn't stop thinking about Philip, but this time I couldn't take my eyes off of Thomas. I was just noticing that Thomas wasn't skinny. He was emaciated. His eyes weren't deep-set, but rimmed with dark circles. He stood there shivering, but I swear I was seeing Philip. Suddenly, his father reeled forward and smacked him across the face. Philip, no, Thomas, went flying across the room, collapsing to the floor. Candace laughed. I felt sick. I know. What I had been planning was far worse, but this, I couldn't imagine that child raised in a hell like this. My mind went to Will. The police had told me his psychosis was likely something he'd been born with, but now I had to wonder what his childhood had been like. The thought made me sick. I couldn't watch anymore. Candace and Marcellus's laughter rang in my ears as I crept around the house. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do now, but I was still going to check the layout. I found what I assumed to be a storage room. It was mostly bare, but for a few clothes strewn along the floor. It was dank and dingy. I wondered why it had a window. I still assumed it was a storage room, until I saw Thomas creep inside, closing the door behind him and crawling into the corner of the room. He curled on a pile of clothes, shuddering. I almost left right then and there. Just drove back home. My revenge would be to let this child suffer. I'm glad I didn't. I won't go into detail about what I saw next. You'll probably be able to guess it. His father, if you can call him that, opened the door and descended upon him. He didn't cry out. He seemed used to it. I covered my ears to keep out the awful panting sounds. Thomas didn't cry until after his father left the room. I watched him slowly pull his clothes back on, huddled in the corner. That was when I made my decision. He looked up at me, knocking on the window. Maybe he could tell I didn't mean to hurt him. Maybe he wasn't afraid of being hurt anymore. He opened the window and stared at me with a guarded expression. "What do you want?" The voice was thin and shaky. It bore straight down to my heart. I looked him straight in the eye and smiled. "I'm a good man. I'm here to take you away from this bad place." It didn't take much convincing to get Thomas to leave with me. There was nothing keeping him there anyway. I took him home to my mother. The sight of that tiny, starving, beaten child pulled her out of her shell. She rushed to his side, gathering him into her arms. Together we cleaned him up, got him fed, and gave him a place to stay. It took him a long time to open up. For days, he wouldn't talk. It was 1 week after we'd taken him in when he looked up at me and opened his mouth for the first time. "Did my big brother send you?" My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't sure how to broach this subject. I cautiously asked, "Why would you say that?" He looked down at his feet. "Will said he'd come back to save me. He was the only one who ever loved me. Thomas is doing better now. He laughs and plays like a normal kid. Forging the documents for him was difficult, but not impossible. He'll be starting school soon. My mother loves having him around. I think she sees Philip in him too. But we also love Thomas for the sweet child he is. In the end, I lost my chance for revenge. The only thing precious to Will, and instead of torturing it, I protected it. But as Thomas curls up on my lap and drifts to sleep, I can't find it in my heart to regret my decision. From now on, I'll give him all the love that I can't give Philip.